Let's continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 19, the last chapter, Epilogue. He had never kept a diary, and he had ruled out autobiography. He thought self-absorption was a bore. He has a motto, which is in French, Après mort les deluge. But this did not prevent him from making attempts to put his life in order. I entered his life as a biographer in 1987 to assist him in the work of remembering. He was very at first, telling the old stories in routine fashion, and only after several years beginning to stray from the well-worn grooves into the subjects and themes he had buried within himself. During one of these long sessions over the tape recorder in his rooms in Albany, I asked him the central question about the relationship between his life and his work. How a person who had not lived a tragic life should have put such emphasis on tragic choice and show such empathy for people racked with inner conflict. His reply was brisk. My life is the opposite of my views. I believe all choice is painful, not that choice is painful to me. If this were true, his work was a demonstration not of what it owed to his life, but what it owed to his capacity to imagine lives other than his own. When I asked him about his serene, mysterious well-being, he replied in his calm, deflationary style that he was happy because he was superficial. I live much more on the surface than people suppose. So his life, he wanted me to understand, was a testament to the virtues of the lightness of a being. For the Jerusalem Prize, awarded before his 70th birthday, he wrote what turned out to be his only venture into extended intellectual autobiography, detailing the three strands in his life, Russian, English, and Jewish, which he had braided into the single skein of his identity. That skein is spelled as S-K-E-I-N, not skin. From the Russian thinkers, he beloved Herzl and Turgenev. He had taken his fascination with ideas and his sense that they had the power to enslave man, no less than nature or institutions. From the Russian tradition, too, came a sense of the essentially admonitory and moral function of the intellectual. From the British side, he took his empiricism, the conviction that the world was as our senses hold it to be. A Jerusalem audience with bitter memories of the British mandate might not have been happy about it, but he also ascribed to the English the entire content of his political beliefs: toleration, free discussion, respect for the opinions of others. As for the third and the final strand, he told his Jerusalem audience that he owed to Judaism the fact that his liberalism had given such room to the human need to belong. It had been a mistake for the philosophers of the Enlightenment to suppose that men and women would live their lives according to abstract principles, cosmopolitan values, and what he called idealistic but hollow doctrinaire internationalism. He went on, quote, "This rejection of nature ties seems to me noble but misguided. When men complain of loneliness, what they mean is that nobody understands what they are saying. To be understood is to share a common past, common feelings and a language, common assumptions, possibility of intimate communications. In short, to share common forms of life. To be a Jew, he said, was to have a special understanding of this loneliness. It was also to know how deeply men and women needed to be at home somewhere in the world. Belonging was more than possession of land and statehood. It was the condition of being understood itself. He said, do tribute to what he owed his people, but he knew that he was not necessarily understood better or more truly in Israel than anywhere else, or even that he himself understood Israel especially well. The last 20 years of his life saw him ever more perplexed, angered, and depressed by what had happened to his Zionist dreams. He had believed in partition since the Peel Commission of 1937, and to the end of his life he saw himself as a two-state Zionist, committed both to the state of Israel and to sharing the land with the Palestinians. Indeed, the situation embodied exactly those conflicts between competing goods that his own philosophical view regarded as inescapable in moral life. In a conflict between two rights of self-determination of equal validity, he could not envisage any other solution than for Israel to cede significant parts of the occupied territories to a Palestinian authority. This steady conviction set him against the Begin and Shamir governments. Quietly, in interviews and letters to Israeli friends, he aligned himself with a peace now. But a vehement public stance was not in his nature, and in any event, he always believed that advice from outside, even if pre-offered by a Jew, would always be rejected. Still, the thought that he had not stood up to be counted nagged at his conscience. As he rethought his relations to Israel, so too he gave a new thought to Judaism. Nothing was recounted, but much was made plain that had been implicit. In matters of faith, he remained what his friend Jerry Cohen called a verificationist atheist. Faithful to the anti-metaphysical convictions of Oxford logical positivism of the 1930s. But he was a skeptic rather than a heretic, and he expressed this radical skepticism gently, assuring the former chief rabbi, Emanuel Jakubowicz, that he would certainly like to believe in God and an afterlife, but had simply no evidence that such things existed. Yet religious skepticism lived happily with religious observance. Wherever he was in the world on Yom Kippur, he made a point of fasting and going to synagogue. As long as his mother was alive, he celebrated the Passover every year in her house. After her death, the ceremonies were held either at Haddington House or at the home of Peter Oppenheimer and his family in Oxford. Oppenheimer, economics dan and a leading figure in the Oxford Orthodox community, was linked by marriage to the Oxford pastor Knox. So he and Berlin were bound by things Jewish and Russian alike. The Passover Seder was sometimes a grand social occasion, with Lord Rothschild, Lord Goodman, the painter R.B. Kittredge, and Maury Parahia, the pianist, in attendance. At other time, it was more intimate, with only the Oppenheimers and Allen's children and grandchildren. The passages were read and sung in Hebrew, and Berlin took a full part, sometimes explaining the significance of certain features of the ritual to the younger children. The celebration of freedom within his tradition meant a great deal to him, and he never missed it. The same hold for Rosh Hashanah. If he was in Jerusalem, he celebrated the New Year with his friends Avisha and Anna Magdalene and their children. Many of his Jewish friends were surprised that Berlin never took his Judaism in the direction of reform. The reform movement was supposed to purify Judaism of archaicism and adapt its ethical message for a modern day. But Berlin was adamant that if there was to be observance, it had to be as authentic, as traditional, as close to the ancient faith as possible. He joked, "The Orthodox synagogue is the synagogue I'm not attending." But he did attend twice a year, and these observances were essential scaffolding for his calendar. Ritual returns to his origins, which was something more than ancestor worship. For all his skepticism, his respect for the religious content of the ritual was unfeigned. He was repelled by the callow anti-clericalism of the Voltairean Enlightenment and had traced most of the evils of the 20th century to the idolatry of secular reason. "Stone-dry atheists," he once wrote, "don't understand what men live by." He respected the Jewish tradition and the religious feeling in general, precisely because it taught men the limits of their reason. In a letter written in 1981, commenting on Peter Oppenheimer's sermon at the Oxford Synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, Berlin observed, "The validity of a religion should not, in my view, depend on its moral implications. It is a transcendent, absolute, orders things which, in human terms, may be horrifying, as so often in the more blood-shedding exploits in the Old Testament, but are the essence of a truly religious attitude." In retrospect, it seems obvious why, when Igor Stravinsky had asked him to provide a libretto for a cantata on a religious theme, Berlin had thought immediately of the bending of Isaac. Here was a religious law at its most peremptory and inhuman. Yet this was precisely what commanded Berlin's respect. He could vividly imagine Abraham leading his son up the stony hill to the place of sacrifice. Here, at the heart of his own tradition, was the terra bellita, the awesome and implacable necessity which he had admired in the novelist music, the grandeur, on a scale that dwarfed the merely human. To be sure, he was repelled by Abraham's blind submission and by the cruelty of the command itself. But these emotions were easy. With his usual fascination for states of mind radically alien to his own, he was gripped by the human capacity to obey a command beyond its own understanding. It is possible that this deep understanding of a necessity, of aspects of life that could only be experienced as a command or a fate, saved him from raging at the dying of the light. This was not a religious attitude exactly, but it did involve a acceptance, even a resignation, which might have been more difficult had he been of a more rationalist temperament. He gave more and more thought to dying, discussing it with close friends in a bemused way, as if admiring a distant view or a perplexing painting. He did admit to being afraid of dying, but he thought it was incoherent to fear death itself. It was at the age of 86 that he quoted Epilogue to a journalist. Quote, "Why are you afraid of death? Where you are, death is not. Where death is, you are not. What is it that you fear?" End quote. Death, he insisted, often quoting a remark of Wittgenstein's, quote, "is not an event in life." End quote. He thought it nonsensical to suppose that his own life had a plan or a destiny, that he had made manifest the direction or purpose which had been latent within. Such order as it appeared to have was only apparent after it was lived. Prospectively, life had no shape whatever. Its shape was made in the living. Characteristically, these thoughts were expressed only as said in a text written towards the end of his life, in response to a request from a Chinese academic for an account of his work to be included in the Chinese Guide to Anglo-American Philosophy. It delighted Berlin to think of his work reaching the last bastion of at least nominal faith in communism. In this essay, he quoted his beloved Herzl and came as close as he ever did to spelling out a personal credo. Quote, "Where is the song before it is a song? Where indeed, nowhere, is the answer. One creates the song by singing it, by composing it. So, too, life is created by those who live it, step by step." End quote. The song held his attention to the very end. One of his favorite rituals, conducted in the upstairs study at Huntington House with his secretary, Pat Woodchin, was the booking of concert tickets as far in advance as possible. It was a gamble on life to be planning for Glendeborn, Salzburg, or Passaro 2 years hence, where he was 86. But when he had given Pat Woodchin his instructions and the diary was well and truly filled in, he would sit back and sigh with satisfaction. Once, as she went away and left him alone, she took back and saw him in his armchair, quietly murmuring to himself in a voice at once sad and full of pleasure, quote, "I do so love music." End quote. In 1996, the National Portrait Gallery offered Lucien Freud an open commission to paint a portrait of his own choosing. He asked if he could paint Isaiah. The two men had first met in Marshfield Gardens in October 1938. When they took tea in the garden with Freud's grandfather, over Viennese cakes, Lucien had told Sigmund that he had been to see Romeo and Juliet. The old man laughed. I thought you were your own Romeo. Now in a studio in a house on Kensington Church Street. Lucien, aged 74, and Isaiah, aged 86, met again. There were more than a dozen sittings, and they took up the better part of the mornings. Isaiah sat in an old, battered armchair while Freud sketched him first in pencil and then began to paint him in oils. The time passed in gossip and then in silence, broken by the sound of charcoal on paper and paint on canvas. As Freud worked, Isaiah passed in and out of sleep. In a charcoal drawing, roughly 8 by 10 inches, Isaiah's eyes are closed, his head back against the back of the armchair, his mouth shut. The curvature of his upper lip is perfectly cut, as is the shape of his bare forehead and his cheeks sunken and hollowed with age. In the oil painting, not much larger than a regular sheet of paper, Isaiah is shown leaning back with his head resting on the back of the battered armchair. Unlike the pencil sketch, his eyes are open. He's looking away to the left, full of melancholy, at something we cannot see. The portrait was never finished. On 17th July 1997, he came into Ellen's room in a small hours over the morning. He had been vomiting and was fighting for breath. An ambulance was called and he was taken to hospital, where doctors struggled to restore his breathing and clear the vomit inhaled into his lungs. There had been episodes of vomiting before, but this time he came down with pneumonia. He was in hospital for a month, unable to see anybody except Alien and 1 or 2 of his closest friends. Acute constriction of his esophagus made it painful to swallow and also dangerous, since he risked choking and ingesting more fluid into his lungs. As a result, he began to lose weight, and his heart was weakened by recurrent fits of choking. For the first time, his closest friends found him genuinely depressed and unhappy. When Pat Utachin said gently that he had no choice but to grin and bear it, he said he was bearing it all right, but the grinning was becoming impossible. Yet a certain spark remained. Once Bernard Williams arrived to find Isaiah asleep in his room, and Rennie Brandel, fresh from the country in her riding gear, reading the paper and waiting for Isaiah to awake. The two talked about him for many minutes while Berlin slept. After a while, they gently woke him. Had he heard what they were saying? He smiled every word. When he returned to the Huntington house in August, he was weak and too ill either to read or to receive any but his very close oldest friends. With the assistance of Casimiro and Claudina Botajo, Alien and his friends now tried to revive him. They did their best, but he was dejected and told Jerry Cohen, his successor in the Churchilly chair of political theory, that life had lost its savor. His stamina was diminishing by the day, yet he struggled on, determined to keep to old, life-giving routines. Pat Utachin still came for the morning ritual of a dictation and up to the end of October. He was replying to his correspondence. The abiding passion and the themes passed through his life once more in the final weeks. He received a letter from Anatoly Newman, his friend and biographer of Akhmatova, enclosing some reflections on Akhmatova's love of Dante. Berlin had a special affection for Newman and for the Russian generation of the 1960s, who had so courageously kept faith with the best of the Russian pre-revolutionary tradition, and so his farewell letter to Neyman, the last he ever wrote, was marked with a special tenderness. But there was other farewell still more painful to make. It plagued him that he had done so little to help the beleaguered Israeli liberals who still stood by the idea of giving land for peace, like his hero Turgenev, who, when dying of cancer, had dictated A Fire at Sea to Pauline Weldot to acquit himself of a change of cowardice. Berlin dictated a public appeal for political compromise in Israel. On 16 October 1997, on no one's initiative but his own, he composed a statement imploring Israelis to accept a final partition of the land with the Palestinians. Jerusalem must remain the capital of the Jewish state, but he urged Israelis to agree to an international UN guarantee for the right of Muslims to have access to the holy places of Jerusalem, and for the Palestinians to have a right of abode in Jerusalem under international guarantee. The alternative, he warned, was an interminable cycle of terrorist chauvinism on both sides and a savage war. The appeal was sent to his closest Israeli friends, Avashi and Anna Magalit. He was putting order into his life, making peace with his conscience. On 23 October 1997, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, wrote to Berlin about the future of the European left. In an interview conducted by Stephen Lux in 1991, but only published in Prospect magazine and accepted in the Sunday Telegraph in September 1997, Berlin had wondered aloud whether the left, as such, had any future at all. Where, he asked, were the new ideas? Liberalism and socialism had always been fierce enemies. Berlin's doctrine of a negative liberty had been a plea for human freedom against even the best-intentioned socialist paternalism. Blair wanted to argue with this. Wasn't it true, the Prime Minister wanted to know, that the limitations of a negative liberty in Western societies had motivated generations of people to find some model of a society that went beyond laissez-faire? Surely, he suggested, positive liberty had its validity, whatever its depredations in the Soviet model. Berlin's ideas retained all their capacity to provoke, but he was now too ill even to reply to Prime Minister. In the last week of October, Isaiah asked to see me. He was seated in the easy chair by the door of the downstairs study in Huntington House, books and journals scattered unread on the table by his elbow. He was gaunt and pale, and his immaculate tweed suit hung loosely about him. At one point, I helped him shift his weight in the chair, and as I lifted him, I was shocked to feel the bones of his rib cage beneath his suit. He was weak but lucid, with a feverishly intensity I could not remember in previous meetings. He reviewed the more or less grim options that lay before him. The doctors were saying that the constriction of his esophagus and the loss of weight left them no option but to insert a feeding tube in his stomach. He thought this was a dreary possibility, but he was resigned to it. There were no good choices left, he said, with a little shrug. But this was not what he really wanted to say. I drew my chair up until our knees were almost touching, and he leaned forward and talked in a hectic whisper, ranging back and forward across the whole expanse of his life, correcting possible misapprehensions about this or that detail, worrying that I might have misunderstood certain confessions and asides. It pained me to think that he had been worrying about biographical truth. He needed all his strength for more important things, but I couldn't get him to change the subject. He wanted to leave the record straight. This too was painful, because it was out of character. All along, he had said he didn't mind what sense I made of his life. This had freed both of us. His carefully cultivated indifference to my project had been a form of generosity, an attempt to lighten the weight of our friendship. But now we were both facing the moment of a closure, when suddenly words took on an urgency they had never had before. Time, which had stretched out before us over so many afternoons in the past, when the clock on the mantelpiece sounded the hours and the talk ranged over the whole of his life, now seemed fearfully short. His strength was ebbing away before my eyes. He had just enough energy for one more thought. In a voice just above a whisper, he said how much he loved Eileen and how much she had been the center of his life. This was what he most wanted me to understand. I said I did understand, and then I took his hands and tried to reassure him that I would do my best. What I meant, though I did not manage to say it, was that I would do my best not to betray him. I would repay the trust he had placed in me so easily, with so little calculation, 10 years before. I wonder to this day whether he knew what I was trying to say. When I left, I bent over his chair and kissed him once on each cheek, and once for good measure, as we had always done. After Eileen saw me out and I walked down the driveway, I passed the window of the downstairs study and saw him there, for the last time, his head sunk forward, asleep. He went into hospital on the afternoon of 4th November to have the feeding tube fitted into his stomach. He was recovering from the operation on the evening of the next day, when he had another attack of choking and died immediately. On Friday, 7 November, as every paper in Britain and most in North America and Europe carried his obituary, and as the papers in Israel carried the text of his final appeal for peace, he was buried in the Jewish section of Oxford's Wolvercote Cemetery. His family and friends spaded wet earth onto his grave, and afterwards the chief rabbi in tone in both Hebrew and English. Quote, Tahanishmato Tarashwa Besra Hachim. May his soul be bound in the bonds of everlasting life. Vihizero Baroque, and may his memory always be a blessing. In the days following his death, newspapers and magazines on both sides of the Atlantic accorded him the space in their obituary pages usually reserved for statesmen. The tone of most pieces was reflective and respectful, but there was a venom from the left and the right, and these pieces confirmed what he had always believed, that for all his success, the ground on which he stood had always been narrower than most people supposed, and his liberalism had always been embattled. But it was also clear that he had been loved, especially by the English who had given him his home. In an article in the Daily Telegraph, his All Souls colleague, William Waldegrave, said, quote, If you had asked me to show you what I meant by the ideal of English, I would have taken you to see a Latvian, Jewish, German, Italian mixture of all the cultures of Europe. I would have taken you to see Isaiah Berlin, end quote. At a memorial commemorations in the Hampstead Synagogue, Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre, and the British Embassy in Washington, his closest friends tried to capture what he had meant to them, to remember what had been so distinctive. In Washington, K. Graham recorded that when he was asked to speak more slowly, if he wanted the Americans to understand him, he had replied, quote, Yes, I know, but if I did, I should be quite a different person, end quote. In Oxford, his friend from Jerusalem, Avashi Margaret, remembered Isaiah as the prince of the exiles. Noah Annan said that Isaiah had taught him to think more clearly, to feel more deeply, to hope and to put my trust in life. Stuart Hampshire, white-haired, leaning on a stick, his voice suddenly breaking, paid tribute to his life-creating friend. Bernard Williams said that he would always think of Isaiah listening to music, slightly bent forward, head on one side, listening, beyond any talk, any arguments, any history. End quote. At the commemorative farewells, there was music from every quarter of his past. The Laments of the Cantor, a Bach Sarabanda, played by Isaiah Stern, the Andante from Beethoven's Quartet, Opus 130, and the Andante sostenuto of the Schubert B-flat Major Sonata, played into the stillness of the Hampstead Synagogue by Alfred Brendel. The pianist's tribute to the man he wished had been his father carried all that was inexpressible in the mourning of those who had loved him. When the final notes had died away and the audience in the synagogue filed into the winter streets of northern London, many were seized by a common presentiment that such events had never been complete without Isaiah's judgment over them. For the first time we were leaving a grand occasion without being able to enjoy the whispered coda that had always marked the essential conclusion to such occasions. The source of all the verdicts that had mattered was now gone. When he was 85, I asked Isaiah what had most surprised him about his life. He said, the mere fact that I should have lived so peacefully and so happily through so many horrors. End quote. A survivor's guilt always shadowed his happiness. How could he forget the darkness? It had claimed his very own. It had been the worst century there has ever been, in wanton destruction of innocent human life, and in murderous unreason masking itself as reason. It was this sense of ambient darkness that gave a somber eloquence to the best of his writing and the passion to his intellectual vocation. But he did not allow the times to dictate to his nature. Biography is the art of the singular, and he was absolutely singular. The voice, the mind, the playfulness of both, the lightness of his being, and the gravity of his best ideas were at one of a kind. In a dark century, he showed what a life of the mind should be: skeptical, ironical, dispassionate, and free. That's the end of the chapter and the book.